continuing on in the laws of Rosh Hashanah with Siman Tov Kuf Pei Ches, section 588, Zman Tekiyah Shofar, the time for blowing the Shofar, Avoy Tes Ifim. This has 9 Ifim. So we've spoken about what constitutes a kosher Shofar, what doesn't. We've spoken about the brachas for it. We've spoken about the issues with being in a barrel or a cavern and blowing shofar. So now we're going to talk about the proper time for blowing shofar. We know that all positive mitzvahs have the who, the what, the why, the where, the when. They have all those aspects. And now we're going to talk about the when for blowing shofar. So let's jump right in. Aleph, Zman Tekiyah Shofar B'Yom. The time when you're supposed to blow shofar is the day. All right, simple. Shenamar, there's a pasuk Yom Trua V'Gomer. We know that it's called the day of the sounding of the shofar, and there it's B'Yom V'Lo B'Layla. It's daytime and not nighttime. V'Cho Hayom Kasher Tekiyah Shofar, and the whole day is good for blowing shofar. Me'alas HaShachar, from the very beginning of dawn, called Alas HaShachar, Ad Tzeisa Kechavim, until nightfall, which is when there's an appearance of stars. So you really have the whole day to blow shofar. Eile, she'achachamim hitzrechu lahamtin ad shetanei tzachama sheyatzu mikol safek halayla. But the chachamim wanted us to wait a little bit longer than olais. So olais is when you have the first kind of embers, the first lights. They wanted us to wait to nates, which is sunrise. Why? Because they didn't want there to be a question if it was still nighttime or not. Because that first piece of olais, it could be close. So they wanted to push off to give us a buffer zone. She'ein hako bekiyin b'amud hashachar, because most people are not experts in knowing exactly when to tell if it's nighttime or daytime at that moment. To me, komakim nonetheless, im avar v'saka v'sha'ala amud hashachar kaidim netzachama. But what if you messed up? You got up super early and you blew shofar before netzachama, before sunrise, but it's after after those the first appearance of dawn. Then yatsa, you're yatsi. You don't have to blow it again a second time. You fulfilled your obligation. And this is practical, obviously you'd have to speak to a Rav first, but say on Mivtzayim, you have someone who might not want to or might not be able to hear shofar the whole rest of the day, and the only time you can get him to hear shofar is between Ois Shachar Netzachama. So this is an important halacha to have in your back pocket. Beis. Im Shama Miktas Tekiyah. Kaidam Amud Shachar, and Miktas Achar Amud Shachar, Nizbar B'Siman Tavkov Pei Zayin. Now, what about if you heard part of the shofar before Ois Shachar, so when you weren't allowed to, and you heard part of it after? In other words, you have an admixture of non-kosher shofar sound with a kosher shofar sound. That's what we explained. It says in the previous Siman, and hopefully we all remember the halacha, is that these admixtures are not kosher. That was one of 3 examples the Alter Rebbe gave toward the end of the last Siman. One of them was, remember the sound was part echo, part legitimate sound. One of them was the part of the tekiah had kavana, part didn't, and this was actually the second of the 3 examples. And in all of them we said they're not kosher because what's the klal? This is like a good way to review for yourself. The general rule is that the shofar sound has to be kosher from beginning to end. And in this case, it wouldn't be. Gimel. Shama Tesha Tekiyas, B'Tesha Shaus, B'Yayim. So what if you heard the 9 shofar blasts over 9 hours? So you heard 1 shofar blast, an hour later you came back for the second one, an hour later. You're really extending your Rosh Hashanah davening. Oy, Mitesha B'nei Adam Shetaka Bechad. Or you have in shul a whole choir, so to say, people blowing shofar. 9 people are all blowing it at once. Nizbar b'siman tavkov tzadik. These halachas we are going to explain in 2 simanim. Daled. Yom Tov Rosh Hashanah shecholios b'Shabbos. Ein taken b'shofar. Now, if Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos, and the way our calendar is set up, it can only be the first day of Rosh Hashanah. But if that day falls on Shabbos, we know we do not blow the shofar. Afalpi shetekiyah b'shofar ein a malacha. Now, blowing the shofar, it's not a malacha. It's not one of the 39 prohibited labors. It's not one of the derivatives of it. It's not. It's only that it's rabbinically prohibited to blow on Shabbos and also on other yontivs. In other words, on Pesach you can't decide to start blowing shofar mid-seder. So it's rabbinically prohibited. Why? Mishum, the category called uvdin dechol. It's a weekday or a mundane activity. That's why. That's why the Chachamim, or that's how they classified it in the prohibition. V'lama ein doichin iser kal, kazeh mipnei mitzvahs aseh shel atayra, k'mo shedoichin oiseh b'chol yom tov shel Rosh Hashanah, v'ayo ve'ein by shvus gamor. Now, big question. How could this, so to say, light prohibition, we're saying it's a weekday activity. It's a very minor prohibition the Chachamim set up that category as. And that is not going to override, that is going to override a biblical, a deraisa, a Torah commandment, shofar. I mean, it's no joke. And it's, in fact, to tell you over in by shvus gomer, it's not even what we call a shvus, which is another category that's rabbinically prohibited because it looks like something that's a biblical prohibition, or it might lead to a biblical prohibition. So that almost would be a kind of like a more serious case than of nidachol. It's not even that. And yet, because we said that it's this category of nidachol, not do we just say you shouldn't do shofar, but we actually prohibit it on Rosh Hashanah itself when that's the mitzvah of the day. And that's obviously a big question. The Chachamim answer, Lefi she'kol chayavim b'tekiyas shofar v'ein hakol b'tekiyas shofar, because everyone has to hear the sounds of the shofar, but not everyone knows how. Now, if you're in a big community with a lot of people who know how to blow shofar, you wouldn't even think of this because you just go to shul and someone knows. But what if that's not the situation? What if you're in a place or a time where no one else knows and you're stuck? What are you going to do? So in that case, you're going to want to learn how to blow shofar. And therefore, Gezerah Shema, it's called a Gezerah. This is an enactment of the Chachamim, but it's Shema, it's to prevent something. What is it preventing? Yitzlenu biyadoi v'yelech eitzo habaki lilmod v'avidenu daud amos b'rishus harabim. You're going to take the shofar in your hand. You're going to go walk more than daud amos, more than the 6 feet that you can go in the public domain, in which case you're carrying on Shabbos, because you want to go to someone who knows how. You're going to bring it to the neighboring town, the neighboring village, or even your next door neighbor could be. And you're going to bring it to someone else to learn to blow. And because of that, the Chachamim prohibited it. Now, of course, the question still stands. This is still a relatively light prohibition. And why, what about the big tzaddikim? They already know how to blow shofar. They're not going to be carrying it outside. Why should they be prohibited? And this is a classic question in Chassidus. There's so many Maimarim that begin with this question about blowing shofar, why you don't blow shofar on Shabbos, whether it's in the Alter Rebbe's writings, whether it's in Samach Vav. It's repeated numerous times. And the general gist of the answer, Api Chassidus, is that because blowing shofar on Shabbos is unnecessary. Not just is it unnecessary, but it would be extraneous. Why? Because the levels that Shabbos achieves are so much higher than the shofar can achieve. And therefore, there's no reason, so to say, to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. And because there is this little prohibition, no reason to even more, to be over and to break a minor prohibition, because you don't need the shofar on Shabbos. Shabbos achieves a much higher level. All right. Hey, v'din tiltu ha-shofar b'Shabbos. Now, if it is, again, Rosh Hashanah on Shabbos, what can you use the shofar? Is it muksa? And we're going to treat it as the same muksa status as you would any other Shabbos. And we know any other Shabbos, you can't move the shofar. In other words, the laws are that the only times you can move the shofar is, and again, this is a very brief introduction to the concept. In the laws of Shabbos, we learn a lot more about this, but you can only move it because either what we call tzarech mekaymi, that you need its place. It's sitting on your only chair. You need to sit down. Or because you need it for some purpose. In other words, especially back in the day, people didn't have a lot of objects. Say your shofar was, something that he says, Dahainu lismech bayes hakaarda. That's what's going to support the dishes that you need to serve on Shabbos or something like that. In that case, you can use it, but otherwise you cannot move it. When does this apply? B'Shabbos. We're talking about Shabbos. Avol imchol bechol. But now, if it's a weekday, if it falls on a weekday, afol pi shemuter l'taltaloi. Now, it is permitted to move on a regular weekday, it's a Monday, Tuesday, Yontiv. Even if you don't need to use the shofar for itself, even if you don't need its spot, because you're going to blow it all day. So obviously you're allowed to carry it to shul, you're allowed to move it, etc. It's not an issue. And again, in the laws of Shabbos, it explains it, but it's going to have the same laws as any other, so to say, utensil that you need for a purpose. Example would be a fork, all right? A fork you're allowed to use on Shabbos. It's a permitted object. So it has different laws than something that's not allowed to be used, like a pencil. Now, here's the thing, caveat though, we're calling it a utensil, but don't treat it like a utensil. In other words, it's going to be used for a mitzvah. In this example, you cannot be using it to rest your dishes on. Now, we said on the Shabbos, that was one of the reasons you could move it, but why is that? Because it's not set aside for a mitzvah on a regular Shabbos. But here in Rosh Hashanah itself, on a Yontiv weekday, you're going to be blowing the shofar. You just did. It's a mitzvah object, so don't degrade it. Sharei huktzah mitzvasai. It's being set aside. It's set for a mitzvah purpose. Moshe Siman Tafresh Samach Hey Ayin Sham, as explained elsewhere in Shulchan Aruch, that you cannot use it for a inappropriate purpose. And that section actually is not extant in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, but if you look at the Mechaber, it's talking about an esrog and how you shouldn't be munching on your esrog on Sukkot, again, because it's set aside for a mitzvah. Now, interesting example now, Vav, Katan Hatekeya B'Shabbos Zoi. Now, what if on that Shabbos, a kid's blowing shofar? They don't know the rules, or, they don't care about it. They're blowing shofar, they're having fun. Bezdin, mitzuvin l'hafrishai afal pisho higia l'chinuch. Even though this kid hasn't reached the age of chinuch, the Bezdin has to stop him from blowing shofar on Shabbos. Commotion Isbar Siman Shin Mem Gimel Ayin Sham, as explained elsewhere in Shulchan Aruch. And in that source, and it's important to see that, the Alter Rebbe brings a nuance of when does the Bezdin have to stop a child from doing an Avera, when is it not their business, so to say, because often it's not the Bezdin's, I don't want to say it's not their problem, it's not their responsibility to do it. It's when it's going to be something public. And a kid blowing shofar makes a loud sound, has the chance that people are going to think it's okay to blow the shofar on Shabbos, or that there's certain leniencies to blow it. And because of that, the Bezdin should stop him. Now in parentheses, Afo pi she'ikard mitzvahs Shmias Shofar, he Shmias Kailo Bilvad, Miko Machem. Now, even though, what did we say? The main part of shofar is hearing it, right? So in theory, should it matter who's blowing it? I mean, it's not about the shofar itself. It's not the act of doing it. It's about the sound that comes out of it. So if you have a kosher sound, you should say in theory, I don't care who's blowing shofar, I just need to hear it. That's not the case. Ima Tekeyahu Pater Mitzvah. If the person is pater, if the person who's blowing the shofar does not have a mitzvah to hear the shofar, he cannot relieve the obligation of someone else who has a chiyuv. And again, this is a general klal. This is a general rule we have in halacha in general, but here we see it play out. We're going to see some examples. Here's the groups of people who are pater, who do not have that same level of obligation to hear it. Nashim, women, ve'avadim, slaves, mipnei shehi mitzvahs aseh she'azman gerama, because this is a time-bound mitzvah. And we know the rule is that women and we'll have those slaves do not need to keep mitzvahs that are time-bound. V'cheresh, this is a deaf mute. V'shaites, someone who is mentally incompetent. A katan, this is a minor. Afal pi she'giya lechinuch, even if he comes to the age of chinuch, not bar mitzvah yet. Since they don't have that level of chiyuv, they cannot do the mitzvah on behalf of an adult. So you cannot have a woman, a child, etc., blow shofar and fulfill the obligation for a man. We're going to just point out some specifics now in the next couple of halachas. Zayin, cheresh hashemeya ve'eno medaber. Now, what if someone is mute? They can't speak. What's their classification? Harei hu b'fikeach v'chaya b'tekiyah shofar. They're like any other mentally competent person, and they have to hear it. Their only issue is speaking. And therefore they can be the Baal Tekeya, they can relieve the obligation of others. And practically, someone else will say the bracha. Obviously he can't speak, someone else will say it, and then he's going to blow the shofar. Okay, easy. But now the opposite. What if someone can speak, but they're deaf? They cannot hear. Then this doesn't work. He cannot relieve others' obligations. Because he obviously doesn't have an obligation. Hashem can't obligate him to, it's not going to obligate him if he can't hear. The whole purpose, the whole mitzvah of shofar is to hear the shofar, and he can't do it, so he doesn't have the obligation. Therefore, like we said before, he doesn't have an obligation. He cannot relieve others of their obligation. Ches, suma, a blind person, chayav b'tekiyah shofar. Blind people have to hear shofar, right? You don't need to see anything to hear shofar. V'im haya muchzak b'tekiyah b'chol shana. Now, if he was the official Baal Tekeya and he had a chazaka, he did it year after year after year. Now, and then he's in the shul and he's doing it year after year, and you have some big Talmidei Chachamim there who say, I know that there's an opinion that blind people don't have to keep the mitzvahs in the Torah, and they remove him because, right? They're going to say, if you don't have a chiyuv, you can't fulfill our obligations. They remove him. The imein baki bitkiya kamayhu. Now, if there's no one else who's capable, then what should happen? Yachziruhu liminuyay. They got to put him back in his position. Avo lechatchila ein lesalkai afalpi shenimtza baki kamayhu. But to begin with, guess what? He should have never been removed from his place to begin with. Because the actual halach is that we consider someone who's blind to be obligated in the mitzvahs of the Torah, and therefore that person or that shul committee who removed them did so in error. Final halacha test. Tumtum v'andragonos, a tumtum, which is someone for whom we don't know if he's male or female. It's not that they're confused about it. It's not that they have changed. It's that literally because of anatomic issues, they're one of them. They're either male or female, but because of skin coverage, whatever it is, we can't tell which they are. But they are one of them. And if they had the right surgery, we might eventually figure out which one they are. The androgynous is, in English, we'd say hermaphrodite. It's someone who has both male and female aspects. Both of these groups, ein chayavim, they're not obligated to hear the shofar in their state. Ela misafek sheba hein zacharim. Except we do apply somewhat, so to say, of an obligation, but only because of doubt. Why? Because it's possible we can halachically consider them male. And in the case of the tumtum, the person might be a male in the end. And therefore, because their whole situation currently is in a suffix, it's in a questionable state, and their obligation is therefore questionable, they cannot relieve others of their obligation. They can't blow shofar for others. But mighty who androgynous is androgynous, now one androgynous can fulfill the obligation for another androgynous because they both have that same questionable status. But an androgynous cannot fulfill the obligation of a tumtum, because remember, a tumtum is in reality either male or female. We just don't know. So if they're in this case of being a male, then an androgynous' obligation is at a lower level, and they cannot fulfill the obligation of the tumtum who's actually a male. Now, even one tumtum cannot fulfill the obligation of another, because again, it might be that you have a female trying to blow shofar for a male, in which case, again, obligations are not at the same level. The Shema l'sheyikara tumtum ze yimatze zachar v'lich shetikara zoi timatze nekeva, again, because even though, like I said before, even though there's a doubt about both, what's going to happen? Ultimately, surgery, removing some skins, whatever it is, could show that one was a male and one was a female. It's just that in their current state, it's a suffix, but in reality, one is male and one female. And there's a general rule about suffix, about question. We don't consider something a suffix if we just don't know yet, or if we can't figure it out, or if we don't have enough information. That's not a suffix. A suffix has to be something that you can't know. It's impossible, so to say. So here, the tumtum, we just don't know yet. But in theory, we could know, and therefore we don't consider that type of suffix. So just to review the halachas briefly again, for the Siman, we start out by saying what's the time of sounding shofar. It's all day, from Ois Shachar, from the earliest part of daybreak to Passaic-Clifton until we see the stars. But we said that the Chachamim push the time a little bit forward in the morning to nates, to sunrise, just because not everyone knows exactly when it's dark. But b'diavad, if you blew too early, you're fine. Then in the next halacha, we just reviewed what we learned in the last Siman, that if you start blowing the shofar too early, and then you go into the right time, it's not good because that's an admixture of non-kosher shofar sounds with kosher shofar sounds. In Gimel, we just referenced that eventually we're going to learn about what happens when you split the shofar blowing over the whole day or have a lot of people blowing at once. Daled, we spoke about Rosh Hashanah that falls on Shabbos and said you cannot blow the shofar on Shabbos. And we said it's because it's the level of Uvdin Decho. It's called a weekday activity. Hey, we said the shofar is like muktzah on Shabbos, which means you can only move it if you need its place or if you need its, so to say, purpose to hold dishes. Then we addressed what to do on a weekday with the shofar. And we said there you can move it, you can use it, everything as long as it's for a permitted purpose, so to say. And we also said don't denigrate it in this case by using it to hold dishes or whatnot because you're using it for the mitzvah purpose. In Vav, we talked about how the Beis Din is obligated to stop a child from blowing shofar on Shabbos because it's a public desecration. We also gave the general rule that who is obligated in shofar is men, free men, etc. And the categories that are excluded were women, slaves, children, deaf mutes, mentally incompetent, etc. And we said that they cannot fulfill the obligation of someone who has an obligation. In Zion, we mentioned that not being able to speak is not an issue with shofar blowing, just have someone else say the bracha, but being deaf, because they can't hear it, they don't have a mitzvah of shofar, they cannot fulfill the obligation for others. Ches, we said that a blind person is ultimately responsible for all mitzvahs, and a blind person can absolutely blow shofar for others. And finally, in Tes, we spoke about the tumtum v'androgynous. Neither of them can fulfill the obligation for a man, for someone who has a full obligation. An androgynous can fulfill the obligation for another androgynous, but a tumtum cannot fulfill the obligation for another tumtum.